There's a lady sure.
A song that was never a hit, by the strictest definition of the word. A guitar riff that ended up in federal court, twice. And a legend about a message from the devil, hidden in the grooves. Welcome to Music Chronicle.
There's a feeling I get when I look to the west.
Chapter 1. A Band Under Fire. By 1970, Led Zeppelin had a problem most bands would kill for. They were already massive, and the critics still weren't buying it. Their first two albums had made them one of the biggest live draws in the world, but reviewers routinely dismissed them as noisy, overhyped, and derivative. Then came Led Zeppelin III, a record that pushed the band toward acoustic, folk-inflected material, and the response was, if anything, harsher. Critics who'd wanted heavier riffs called it a retreat. The band that had just tried something genuinely different found itself getting attacked from both directions at once. Guitarist and producer Jimmy Page made a decision in response that still defines how the band is remembered today. For the follow-up record, he insisted the album carry no title, no band name, and no catalog information anywhere on its original sleeve. Atlantic Records pushed back hard, warning him it amounted to professional suicide for a band trying to build on its momentum. Page held his ground anyway. He later explained the reasoning plainly. It wasn't meant to provoke the label. It was meant to answer the critics, by stripping everything away except the music itself and letting listeners judge the songs, with no name attached, to bias them one way or the other. In place of a title, each of the four band members chose a personal symbol to represent themselves, pulled from esoteric reference books and private meaning that, decades later, none of them have ever fully explained. Robert Plant chose a feather inside a circle. John Paul Jones and John Bonham selected symbols from a well-known book of historical signs and sigils. Page designed his own from scratch, a mark so widely mistaken for spelling out a word that fans still call the album Zoso to this day, even though Page has said that reading was never intended. The gamble worked. The untitled fourth Led Zeppelin album became the band's best-selling record and one of the most successful albums in rock history, eventually becoming known simply as Led Zeppelin IV. And buried in the middle of that record's track list sat a song the band had been quietly assembling, in pieces, for the better part of a year. Chapter 2. A song built from cassette. Fragments for decades, the official story of Stairway to Heaven went like this. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant retreated to Bron-Yr-Aur, a remote, centuries-old cottage in the Welsh hills, sat by a fire, and wrote the song together on the spot. It was a perfect origin story for a band built around Celtic mysticism and rural English folklore, and for years, nobody had much reason to question it. Then, in 2016, Page and Plant were placed under oath in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, part of a copyright lawsuit we'll get to shortly. And under that oath, the real story came out a little differently. Page testified that he had actually written the music largely on his own, piecing it together over a long stretch of time, from fragments he'd been recording onto cassette tape, an idea here, a chord change there, accumulated across months rather than conjured in one inspired evening. The song's true origin point, by his own account, wasn't the cottage at all. It was Headley Grange, a converted, drafty old workhouse in Hampshire, where the band gathered to record, where Page first played the completed music through for his bandmates. That doesn't mean Bron-Yr-Aur played no role. Page has said the very first fragment of the piece, the guitar figure that opens the whole song, did come together during an earlier stay at the cottage. It just wasn't the single, mystical moment of creation the story had always implied. It was one piece of a much longer process, built from a cassette recorder, Page kept close by, for exactly this reason, so no idea would be lost before he had a chance to develop it further. The lyrics came together differently, and by every account, closer to the popularized legend. Robert Plant has described sitting near a log fire at Headley Grange with a pencil and paper while the rest of the band worked through the music around him, the words arriving in a rush rather than through careful, deliberate construction. Page has estimated that a large share of the finished lyrics emerged in that single sitting. John Paul Jones later recalled the band's own internal shorthand for what happened next. Page and Plant would return from their writing retreats with a verse and an opening in hand, and the rest of the group would build outward from there, shaping the arrangement together in the room. It's a small but telling correction, the kind that rarely survives 50 years of retelling. The truest version of how Stairway to Heaven was born isn't a single magical night by a fire in the Welsh mountains. It's a long, unglamorous accumulation of scraps on a cassette tape, only fully assembled once the band was back at work in a cold English mansion, with a fire providing warmth rather than inspiration. Chapter 3. Inside the Sessions. At Headley Grange Recording, began in December 1970, at Island Records Basing Street Studios in London, with the fuller arrangement finished the following year at Headley Grange, using the Rolling Stones mobile recording truck parked outside. It's worth pausing on just how unusual the finished arrangement was for its time. The song opens not with guitars at all, but with John Paul Jones playing a pair of wooden recorders, an instrument more associated with primary school music class than hard rock, chosen deliberately for the fragile, pastoral quality it gave the introduction. Jones has said he considered adding a conventional bass line early on and rejected it, feeling it would immediately break the folk atmosphere the recorders had established. The song's structure was built around a slow-motion transformation, moving from that gentle acoustic opening through a series of escalating sections until John Bonham's drums finally arrive, more than 4 minutes into the track, a deliberate, almost architectural decision to withhold the song's full power until exactly the right moment. Engineers who worked the sessions have described the take that finally captured that entrance as an electric moment in the room itself. Bonham's drums landing with such force after so much patient buildup that the rest of the band could only laugh in disbelief when they heard the playback. The guitar solo, now routinely ranked among the greatest ever recorded, very nearly didn't happen the way anyone remembers it. Page attempted the solo at Headley Grange and, after roughly 3 hours of trying and failing to get the performance he wanted, set the idea aside rather than force it. He picked it back up later at Basing Street, choosing to set down his usual Gibson Les Paul in favor of an older, battered Fender Telecaster that guitarist Jeff Beck had given him years earlier, the same instrument Page had used throughout his time in the Yardbirds. Rather than monitoring through headphones the way most guitarists would, Page had the backing track played back through studio speakers, the way a classical soloist might perform, along with an orchestra, and recorded 3 separate improvised takes before settling on the version that made the final mix. Every element of that solo mattered to the finished feeling of the track, right down to small physical details from the room. Studio engineer Richard Digby Smith later recalled watching Page lean against a speaker cabinet as he played, a lit cigarette tucked casually into the strings near the guitar's tuning pegs between takes, the whole performance captured with none of the studio polish modern listeners might expect from a passage this celebrated. Chapter 4. What the song is actually about. Ask 10 Led Zeppelin fans what Stairway to Heaven means, and you'll likely get 10 different answers. And unlike some of the other songs we've covered on this channel, that's not really an accident. Robert Plant has been fairly open about at least some of his source material, pointing to the writings of Lewis Spence, a British antiquarian whose books on Celtic magic and folklore Plant was reading heavily around the time the lyrics came together. Images of a mysterious May Queen, references to spring cleaning and hedgerows, all sit comfortably inside a much older English and Celtic tradition of nature worship and seasonal ritual that Plant had clearly been steeping himself in. Beyond that starting point, though, Plant has consistently resisted offering a single, literal explanation, and has occasionally sounded almost embarrassed by how seriously listeners have tried to decode the lyrics word for word over the decades. What's fair to say, based on the band's own comments over the years, is that the song was never built around one fixed narrative the way a story song might be. It's closer to a sequence of impressionistic images, a listener choosing between 2 roads, a search for meaning dressed in fantasy and folklore imagery, left open enough that generations of fans have projected their own spiritual, romantic, or philosophical interpretations onto it. That ambiguity, whether it was fully intentional from the start or not, is very likely part of why the song has endured as long as it has. A song this open-ended gives every new listener room to make it their own. Chapter 5. The Satanic Panic. In January 1982, a religious broadcaster named Paul Crouch, host of a program on the Trinity Broadcasting Network, made a claim that would follow Stairway to Heaven for the rest of its existence. Crouch alleged that if you played certain passages of the song backward, specifically the section referencing the hedgerow and the May Queen, you could hear a hidden message praising Satan. The claim spread fast, landing right in the middle of a much larger wave of religious anxiety about hidden messages in rock music, a moral panic historians now generally refer to as the Satanic Panic of the 1980s. It escalated well beyond one television broadcast. A California state assemblyman proposed legislation requiring warning labels on records suspected of containing backward messages, and in April 1982, a committee of the California State Assembly held an official hearing on the subject, during which Stairway to Heaven was played in reverse for lawmakers as evidence. A similar bill was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives that same year, and a related measure actually passed the Arkansas legislature before being vetoed and ultimately defeated. Led Zeppelin's label, Swan Song Records, responded to the entire controversy with a single dry line. Their turntables, they said, only played in one direction, forwards. Page addressed it more seriously years later, telling an interviewer plainly that he found the whole episode genuinely upsetting, since the song had been written with nothing but sincere intentions, and deliberately embedding a reversed message was never something that had any place in how he thought about making music. Audio researchers and psychologists who've since studied the phenomenon point to something called reverse phonetics, essentially the brain's tendency to impose recognizable patterns onto ambiguous, reverse sound, especially once a listener has been told in advance exactly what words to listen for. Play almost any sung passage backward and prime someone with a suggested phrase beforehand, and they'll often report hearing something close to it, whether or not anything was deliberately placed there. Nearly 45 years later, no credible evidence has ever surfaced that Led Zeppelin intentionally recorded a backward message of any kind into Stairway to Heaven. What did survive, and what continues circulating to this day, is the legend itself, kept alive as much by curiosity and internet reposts as by anyone's genuine religious concern. Chapter 6. The Lawsuit That Wouldn't Go Away.
The piper will lead us to reason.
The most serious controversy attached to Stairway to Heaven wasn't about the devil. It was about a chord progression, and it took the form of a federal copyright lawsuit that dragged on for the better part of 6 years. The claim centered on Taurus, an instrumental track released in 1968 by the American band Spirit, written by their guitarist Randy Wolf, who performed under the name Randy California. Led Zeppelin had shared concert bills with Spirit early in their career, including some of Zeppelin's first American shows, and the estate representing Wolf, who died in 1997, argued that the descending chord pattern that opens Stairway to Heaven was lifted from Taurus without credit or compensation. The suit was filed in 2014, 4.5 decades after Stairway was first released. The case went to trial in 2016 in Los Angeles. Because Taurus had been registered for copyright before 1972, back when only written sheet music, not actual sound recordings, received federal protection, the jury was legally barred from simply listening to and comparing the two recordings. They could only compare the underlying written composition, performed live in court by expert witnesses, to Zeppelin's finished song. Page testified under oath that he had never heard Taurus before writing Stairway to Heaven, calling the earlier claims of similarity, in his own words, totally alien to him. After a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for roughly a day and ruled unanimously in Led Zeppelin's favor. The case didn't end there. A federal appeals panel later threw out that verdict, ruling that the trial judge had given the jury flawed instructions and ordered a new trial. Led Zeppelin appealed that decision, and in March 2020, the full Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, sitting as an 11-judge panel, reinstated the original 2016 verdict for good, closing the case permanently in the band's favor. Legal analysts noted at the time that the ruling carried weight well beyond this one song, since a loss for Zeppelin might have opened the door to a wave of new lawsuits built around similar claims involving common, widely used musical building blocks. Whatever the courts ultimately decided, the case put a fascinating historical footnote on permanent record. Two of the most influential guitar intros of the late 1960s and early 1970s will now be linked forever in copyright law. Whether the resemblance between them was coincidence, shared musical vocabulary, Or something closer to inspiration nobody involved ever fully admitted to. Chapter 7. Never a single, yet the most requested song on the radio. Here's a detail that surprises a lot of casual fans. Stairway to Heaven was never released as a commercial single, not in the United States, and not in the United Kingdom, for the entire first 36 years of its existence. Atlantic Records did press promotional copies to send to radio stations, copies that quickly became prized collector's items among fans, but ordinary record buyers could only get the song by purchasing the full Led Zeppelin IV album. That didn't stop it from becoming, by some measures, the most requested song in the history of American FM radio. Multiple stations built entire promotional stunts around that reputation. In 1990, a Florida radio station launched an all-Led Zeppelin format with a 24-hour Stairway to Heaven marathon. The following January, a station in Albuquerque played the song more than 200 times over roughly a full day, as a publicity push, while switching its format to classic rock. At just over 8 minutes long, one of the longest songs ever to receive mainstream radio airplay, hearing it once already represented a real commitment of listening time. Hearing it in continuous, hours-long rotation became, for some fans, less a tribute than an endurance test. The song's chart history only caught up decades later. In November 2007, Led Zeppelin's entire catalog finally became available as legal digital downloads for the first time, making every track newly eligible for the UK's official singles chart, which had begun counting downloads that same year. Within days, the 36-year-old original recording of Stairway to Heaven entered the UK singles chart for the very first time in its existence. A strange, delayed piece of chart history for a song that had already spent decades as one of the most recognized recordings in the world. Chapter 8. The song everyone loves to hate. Total ubiquity comes at a cost, and Stairway to Heaven paid that cost in a very specific, very culturally memorable way. By the 1990s, the song had been played so often, at so many radio stations, and in so many music store showrooms, that a genuine backlash had formed, less against the song's quality than against simply hearing it, yet again, for the 1000th time. That backlash reached its most famous expression in the 1992 film Wayne's World, where a music store the film's lead character visits displays a hand-lettered sign reading simply, "No Stairway to Heaven," a joke rooted directly in real behavior at actual guitar shops, where employees had grown tired of every beginner picking up a floor model and immediately fumbling through the same opening notes. The joke landed so hard that it reshaped how an entire generation understood the song, cementing Stairway to Heaven as cultural shorthand for beginner guitar cliches, whether or not viewers had ever set foot in a music store themselves. Even the band members eventually showed signs of fatigue. Robert Plant told the New York Times in 1988 that he'd break out in hives if he had to perform the song at every single show, adding that whatever importance the lyrics carried for him back in 1971 felt much less certain nearly 2 decades later. At the Atlantic Records' 40th anniversary concert in 1988, Page recalled having to talk Plant into performing it at all, and remembered Plant turning to him afterward and declaring flatly that he was never going to sing it again. In 2002, Plant reportedly donated $10,000 to a Portland radio station on the specific condition that the station agree never to play the song again. And yet, for all that public ambivalence, the band kept returning to it, on the occasions that seemed to matter most. They opened their set with it at Live Aid in 1985. They closed out a full-scale reunion performance with it at London's O2 Arena in 2007. And when Led Zeppelin received a Kennedy Center honor in Washington in December 2012, the ceremony's tribute performance built its emotional centerpiece around the song, delivered by Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart, alongside Bonham's son Jason on drums, backed by a full choir and orchestra, while Page, Plant, and Jones watched from the audience, visibly moved. Ann Wilson later described the moment as one of the most powerful highs of her career, a far cry from a song being treated as an afterthought or an obligation. Whatever fatigue the band privately carried toward the song, when the moment genuinely called for it, Stairway to Heaven was still the song they reached for. Chapter 9. Why It Never Actually Left.
All that glitters is gold, and she's
50-plus years on, Stairway to Heaven, remains a fixture of nearly every serious ranking of the greatest rock recordings ever made. Rolling Stone placed it inside the top 35 on its list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. VH1 ranked it in the top 3 on its own list of the greatest rock songs in history. In 2023, it was formally added to the United States National Recording Registry, the Library of Congress's official archive of recordings, judged culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant enough to preserve permanently for future generations. Its physical footprint has proven just as durable. Printed sheet music for the song reportedly still sells somewhere between 10 and 15,000 copies every single year, a genuinely remarkable figure for a piece of music more than 5 decades old. Evidence that new guitarists are still discovering, and still attempting, that opening riff in bedrooms and lesson studios around the world. Guitar World's own readers have voted Page's solo the greatest guitar solo ever recorded, and learning it note for note remains something close to a rite of passage for rock guitarists everywhere. The exact same instinct that turned music stores into a running joke decades earlier. Part of the song's staying power is structural, the same way it's been true for the other epics we've covered on this channel. A composition built around patient transformation, rather than a simple verse-chorus loop, rewards repeat listening in a way most 3-minute singles never could. Part of it is myth. 5 decades of backward-masking legends and courtroom drama that have kept the song part of the cultural conversation, independent of the music itself. And part of it is simply craft, a wooden recorder duet, a drummer patient enough to wait more than 4 minutes for his entrance, and a guitar solo recorded on a borrowed, battered Telecaster with a cigarette still tucked in the strings between takes. Nearly everything about Stairway to Heaven that sounds effortless in hindsight was, in reality, assembled slowly, from fragments, by a band that had something to prove, and all the time in the world to prove it properly. Chapter 10. Rare Facts. Most fans don't know. A handful of details worth knowing, for anyone who thought they'd already heard everything about this song. For live performances, Page swapped his studio Telecaster for a distinctive double-necked Gibson EDS 1275, allowing him to move between 6-string and 12-string parts within the same performance without pausing to change instruments. Meanwhile, since a full string and recorder arrangement couldn't easily travel on tour, John Paul Jones initially recreated those parts on a Mellotron, an early tape-based keyboard capable of approximating orchestral sounds, before later switching to more advanced synthesizers as the technology improved through the decades. In concert, the band routinely stretched the song well past its original 8-minute studio length, sometimes past 10 minutes, with Page adding fresh improvised guitar passages, and Plant occasionally throwing in spontaneous spoken asides mid-performance, treating the song less as a fixed recording to reproduce night after night, and more as a living piece that could shift depending on the room. And the song's reach reliably outpaces even the band's own comfort with it. It's been formally covered, parodied, or referenced by acts ranging from orchestral ensembles to comedy shows, and the phrase "Stairway to Heaven" itself has become a piece of everyday English, invoked in headlines and conversation by people who may never have listened to a single note of the actual song. Few pieces of music from any era have managed to become quite so thoroughly woven into the culture surrounding them, independent of whether the audience actually presses play. Chapter 11. The legacy Led Zeppelin built Stairway to Heaven the hard way.
My thoughts I have seen rings.
Not in one inspired evening by a cottage fireplace, whatever the legend says, but slowly, from cassette fragments accumulated over the better part of a year, refined take after take in a cold English mansion, finished with a guitar solo the band's own guitarist initially couldn't get right and had to walk away from before returning to finish it properly. Nobody involved could have predicted everything that song would go on to survive. A moral panic convinced an entire generation it hid a message from the devil. A federal court case dragged the band back into a Los Angeles courtroom more than 4 decades after the song was written, twice, before the matter was finally settled for good. Radio stations played it so often that guitar shops across America started banning it outright, turning genuine musical achievement into a punchline recognized by people who've never picked up a guitar in their life. Even the band's own singer, at various points, said openly that he never wanted to perform it again. And still, when the moment genuinely called for something to represent everything Led Zeppelin had accomplished, whether at Live Aid, at a reunion show at the O2, or in front of the President of the United States at the Kennedy Center, Stairway to Heaven was the song the band reached for every time. Maybe that's the real measure of a song like this one. Not whether the people who made it ever get tired of it, whether, 50 years on, everyone else somehow never does. If this pulled you into the story, that's exactly what Music Chronicle is here for. Subscribe, and join us next time as we open the door on another song that changed everything.